Hello friends, and welcome of you with this new video of our course Enabling Spring Security in a Spring Boot web application. In this video, as you remember, in the previous video we spoke about implementing the security steps, which we will do it backwards, starting with the DAO authentication provider class, which is an implementation that retrieves the user details, and then we will go to the user details service, from which we can get the principal object, and which will give us a user details object, and then we wrap up this user details with the authentication object, reaching to the security context holder. Now the first thing we will do is that we will go to our security configuration class that we have extended the web security configure adapter and enable web security, and we go to the first method, the first configure method. This first configure method implements, which has an argument of authentication manager builder. Now this authentication manager builder class is this one. This class is simply a security builder to create an authentication manager. The authentication manager is the manager that handles the security of your web application, especially when there is a user login or user registration, registering a new user. So all these things is handled by the authentication manager. Now we can have many implementation of the authentication manager, such as the in-memory authentication, the LDAP authentication, JDBC, and also using the user detail service, but we will focus on the authentication provider, this one which we will focus on, which is this one, the authentication provider, which takes an argument of authentication provider. So we need to create an authentication provider. Okay, so let's see in here. Once we have created an object of this authentication manager builder, we call this authentication provider, which, as we said, takes an authentication provider as an argument. Now this authentication provider, we can get it from implementing the DAO authentication provider. The DAO authentication provider, as we can see here, it's an authentication provider which implements, it's an authentication provider implementation that retrieves the user details from the user details service, as we have said in here. So the DAO authentication provider class is an implementation which retrieves the user details from the user detail service. So this is the DAO authentication provider. This is the core objective of this DAO authentication provider, is to retrieve the data from the user detail service, which also has some methods that we can implement on an object of the DAO authentication. So we will implement this DAO authentication manager object as an argument for the authentication manager builder. Now we can get this object from implementing this method, which we implemented as a bean, and this bean will create an object from the DAO authentication provider, and then we call two of these methods which are in here, the user set user detail service and or set user detail service and the set password encoder. So we will implement these two things. Now the first one, we will set the password encoder because we need to encrypt, and actually not encrypt, to hash the password of the user when the user login or when the user register a new account. We need to hash the password. So we need to use the bcrypt password encoder, this one, which is, as we can get it from implementing this class, the bcrypt password encoder. The second thing, which is the most important thing, which relates the main objective of the DAO authentication provider, is to retrieve the data from the user detail service. This is the main objective of the DAO authentication provider. Once we retrieve this user details, then we can use this object add the authentication manager builder in here. So now our objective is to get and retrieve the user detail service and assign it to the DAO authentication provider object so we can use it with the authentication manager builder. How we can do this? Now the answer is very simple, as we have said in here, is that we need to implement a user detail service interface. We create a class by any name you wish. In my case I call it sign up detail service because it's related to the new sign up registration form when a user wants to register a new account. This is all about for signing up. So I created this class by the name sign up detail service, and I implemented the user detail service. Now this user detail service will be in touch with the database and will retrieve the data from the database. As we can see in here, the user detail service interface, it loads the user specific data. That's the whole point of the user detail service. It's an interface which loads the user specific data. So it's like a user DAO. You remember when we were talking about the Spring Boot in the previous course, building a web application using Spring Boot and Timeleaf, we were creating the DAO, the data access object, because the DAO will be in touch and directly with the database, and from the DAO the service will be in contact with the DAO. So the user detail service will act and will be used as a user DAO, and this is the strategy used by the DAO authentication provider. This interface has only one method. The method is load user by user name. That's it. This is the entire objective of this interface, to load the user by user name. Now let's go to we call this method. This user detail service will give us, as you can see here from this method, will give us a user details. Will return to us a user details. So we will implement this method. Now in my case I'm not using the username, I'm using another argument which is email. I'm not using the name of the user, but rather than the email of the user. So now we need to load this data of the user specific data. The user specific data, we need to load them from the database. How can we do this? It's simple actually. We call the repository, since we have a sign up repository. Now one thing I need to remind you about these two things, probably you'll wonder from where they came. Actually this we created in the previous course, building a web application using Spring Boot and Timeleaf, so I will not go through them again. So for whoever wish to know how we created them, could go and take a look on that course. So to retrieve and load the data of the user, specific data of the user, we call the sign up repository, and the sign up repository has only one method, which is find by email, and from which we can get a sign up module. But this sign up module, we will wrap it with an optional class, a Java optional class, and I'll tell you shortly why we use an optional. Now once we have retrieved the data from the database of that particular user, that particular email, we need to assign this user details, we need to assign it to this user details. So whatever information we have loaded using the user detail service, we need to assign this user specific data to the user details interface. And the way, there are two ways you can do it, either in the second way, which is find by email, and then we assign it to a sign-up model, and this sign-up model we will call an object or a sign-up from this class, the sign-up principal, which uses the user details. We call an object of it, and then we assign as an argument, we put this object here as an argument to the sign-up principal. I hope this is clear. So this sign-up class, which we will reach now, I will tell you all about now. This class, which implements the user details, has a constructor. This constructor takes a sign-up model object. So we create an object of it and need to put this argument. The argument is the sign-up model object, which we can get from the sign-up repository.find by email. This is the second way. The first way, which is the better way, because this way cannot handle if there is any exception. If the sign-up repository couldn't find that email, this will give us an exception. So we need to handle this exception gracefully. Now the best way to handle this exception, if happens, we need to use the optional class of Java. So the sign-up repository, we retrieve the user details, assign it as an object here in this optional class. This optional class, if there is no data, if there is no such an email, then it will give us user email not found. If there is a data, if there is an email exists and there is a user specific data available, then in this case we will get this data using this method, the get method of the optional class, and we will map it to this user details, and we will talk about in a second. So we create a class which implements user detail service. This user detail service have one method only. This method give us a user details. Now we need to load the user specific data from the database. We call the repository, we call the method find by email. This email, if exists, if it doesn't exist, then the optional class will give us this exception, user email not found, which will handle this exception gracefully. In case the email exists, then we will load the data of that email and we assign it, we get the data, and we map it to an object of the sign-up principal, which is a user details. Now let's move to this class, which is the sign-up principal. The sign-up principal, as we remember the principal is a user that is currently interacting with the web application. So we need to retrieve this principal user data. We implement the user details. Remember, now this interface have been already assigned to it the data that we have retrieved from the database using the user details service. So there is now a principal data which we need to deal with it. We need to map it. We need to handle this data that we have collected from here, and we assigned it to the sign-up principal object, to the user details. So we need to handle this data gracefully. Now the first question you might ask, why we didn't connect the user details directly to the database? Remember in the Spring Boot course, we said that the DAO will be in touch with the database. the service cannot be in touch with the database. The service will be in touch with the DAO, and the DAO will be in touch with the database. The same concept in here. The user details cannot be in touch with the database. The user detail service will be responsible for being touching with the database, and when the user detail service load the data of the user, will handle it to the user details. And this we can see in here. For the user details, it's just a core user information, but this is the most important. The implementations are not used directly by Spring Security for security purposes, which is same as what we have said with the DAO and the services. Now, this user details interface has default methods, few default methods. Is enabled, is credentials, is account expired, get username and get password. These are the main method that from the point of view of Spring point of view, it's important. But are we limited only to these methods? No. And now we will see why we are not limited and how we are not limited. So once we implement this user details interface, this user details has this default method which we have just said about. Is enabled, is credentials expired, is account not locked, is account not expired, username and get password. These are the basic method from the Spring Boot security point of view should be presented. All the details that we have loaded using the user details service and we assigned it to the user details, this data will be assigned to these methods. For instance, the password, the username. But there are data that is probably cannot be assigned to this method. So what can we do? How can we deal with this problem? You remember when we designed the web application, the previous course? In the sign-up module, we created a sign-up module, a registration form, just a regular registration form. In that registration form, we created an email, a user ID, password, and also we created some other fields, such as the first name, the last name, the recovery email. Now, these fields, we created for them getters and setters. But if you look carefully, these fields are not presented in the default methods of the user details. They don't present in here. So how can we use this method? And how can we deal with the data that we have loaded using the user details service from the database and we assigned it to the user details? In our case, we have recovery email data, last name data, first name data. So how can we assign to the user details? User details only have these methods. It's very easy. We are not limited only to this method. We can put our own custom method. This method, get email, first name, last name, recovery email, reset token, status, which we will all get from here through the getters and setters. So now, by using our custom methods, we can use all the data, all the user details that we have retrieved in here, and we assigned it to the user details. We can also use it in here. This is the general idea. This is the general contract. So, how we can use this data? For instance, with this method, get password, this is a default method. We can, the object of the sign-up module, and we call the get password. The get password. Okay, the username, in our case user ID. So the object of the sign up model we call the user ID. How about the other fields? How we can assign them? Now these fields, non-expired, we can leave them, we just assign them as true for now. Is enabled, so is enabled, we give it a value of true. The user is enabled. This is enabled, so the getter of this field, we can use it in here. Then we can start with the remaining custom methods. Get email, get first name, get last name. We can use the object of the sign up model and we call that field the getter of that field. This is the way how we can handle all the user details that we have retrieved, that we have loaded using the user detail service, and we assigning it to the user details. This is the way how we can handle all these data. Either we assign it to one of the default methods, these default methods, or we can call the methods or the fields from the model, and we call the getters of these fields, and we assign the data accordingly to these fields. So let's recap with this user details. Once we get all the details of the user details, user specific details from the user detail service, and we assign to the user details, we create a class and we implement the user details. These user details have default methods. We need to fill them with data. So we call an object from the model, and we use whichever suitable getter to that method. If there are any data that cannot be assigned to any of these methods, then we can call our field, the getters of our field, and then we can assign using the model, and we can call the getters of this field, and we assign all the remaining user details. This is the way how we can handle the user details. Now once we have finished this process, of course, don't remember to create an object of the sign up module in here, so you can use it in here. You don't have to auto wire, you just can create an object of it. And in the constructor, this one, the constructor here, which we will use it in here. So don't forget to get this object of the sign up module. Now once we have done all these steps, we go back to the security configuration class. Now we have a sign up details service, the user details service. From this and from this we have made this argument. Now we need to call an object of this sign up details service so we can get it and use it in here. Once we have got this, that means our DAA authentication provider is ready to be used as an argument for the authentication manager builder. Now there are a few points I want to draw your attention to when you do with the security. Now remember, in the authentication manager builder, it's not only limited to the DAA authentication provider. There are a few other ways, as we have said. One of them is using a JDBC based authentication, which is this one. The JDBC authentication. Now, If you decide to go with the JDBC authentication and not with the DIA authentication provider, then you can do it with this way, with these few lines of code. So you call the object, the auth object, JDBC authentication. In this case, you need to provide yourself the details about the user query, about the user name, and the data source from where you can get the data source, which is the database in this case, and you handle the password encoder. You need to do it at this line, at this sequence, if you wish to go with the JDBC authentication rather than the DIA authentication provider. Again, these arguments which are in here, we have made them in our previous course, building a web application using Spring Boot and Timeleaf, so I will not tell you how to do, and also about the data source. So these arguments you can get from that course. You will know how to get them from that course. But this is just a general information. If you don't wish to go with the DIA authentication provider and you wish to go with the JDBC authentication. There is another point I wish to draw your attention to, which is this one. Okay, now when we were talking about the user details interface, we said that it has default methods. One of these default methods is this one, get authorities, which is a collection, comes from the Java collection, and it contains the granted authorities. Now what does that mean? What this method does? Now each user has set of authorities. These authorities either could be roles or authorities. You remember when we were creating a user and we used the sign up DIO implementation, we gave this user some authorities and some roles. For instance, the user, we gave this user two authorities. The first one is registered user authority, and the second authority, change password authority. And this user or any user we create can have multiple authorities, and same as can have multiple roles. The user could have a role of admin, a role of DB manager, role of human resources, any other role. The user can have multiple roles, multiple authorities. So we need to know this principal user what authorities has, what roles has, what authorities has. This is the responsibility of this method, the collection method, and we call it the get authorities, which is this one, the get authorities method, which is a collection of granted authorities, as we have said, the roles and the authorities. Now, how we can get these authorities of this principal user? Now, if we go to the sign up model, if you remember, we created the user role and we created the user authority, and we connected them to the columns user authority DB and user role DB. If you're asking me where we got this, again, this is all at the building a web application using Spring Boot and Timeleaf, so I will not go through again. At that time, when we joined the tables, we joined the tables of the user and the role, and we joined the table of the user and the authorities. We created a list, two lists, one list of string for the roles and one list of string type also for the authorities, and we call them roles list and authorities list. Now, if the user has authorities length bigger than 0, which means this user has an authority, 1 or 2 or more, or the user has a role, 1 or 2 or more, then we can add this authority to a list as an array list, and we make this delimiter between these authorities or between the roles. And you can see this notation here. If user role or user authority has more than one role, then split this string of roles or authorities according to the delimiter we are passing. The delimiter in this case is the comma, and return a list of strings, whether list of roles or list of authorities. And then this list that we create, we will use at the method of the get authorities. How we will use them? Now, to use these two lists of roles and list of authorities, first of all, we create a list of granted authority, and we gave it a name by authorities, or whichever name you wish. Then we start iterate through this list, the role list and the authorities list. We iterate through them, and this iterator will give us a role iterator or an authority iterator. Okay, now we start query, or not query, we start go through this iterator roles one by one using the while loop, and this object role iterator has next, we read it, and then we add it as a simple granted authority, and we get a granted authority. Then this granted authority we add it to this list of the authorities. Remember one thing, and the same thing we will do with the authorities, same as we call the sign up model object the authorities list, and we iterate through it. Has next, we call the next authority, and as a simple granted authority we add this authority, the authority name, and then we add it to the authorities list, this one, the list of the granted authorities. By doing so, we will have a list of all the granted authorities to this principal user, whether they are role or authorities. One thing to notice, when you do the role, you should add the role word preceding the role name. This is by convention, and I forgot to tell you about at the HTTP security, you don't have to, when you has any role, you don't have to add the word role. You don't have to precede the role name by the word role. So you don't have to do this, because this will be added automatically. So by doing this procedure, first we create a list of the roles, and we see if there is roles assigned, then we add them to the lists, and we put a delimiter separator for the roles and for the authorities. Then we create a list of granted authorities. Then we iterate through each list using the sign up model, the object of this sign up model, and we iterate through the list of the roles, and we iterate through the list of the authorities one by one. We add them as a simple granted authority. We get a granted authority object, we add this object to the authorities list. This is the way how we will know what authorities are assigned to this principal user. Now you can do the same thing without iterator. If you use the collection and use for each with the lambda expression, you can get the same result. I prefer the first one, but it's totally up to you, whichever suitable for you, if you wish to go with the for each. Another point I wish to draw your attention to, if you wish to have more information about the principle, what is the meaning of the principle or the authentication object. So if you wish to know more, what is the principle, what is the authentication object, and even what is the security context holder, you could go to these references, which is principle is interface principle, which is part of the Java security. If you want to know more about the authentication object, you could go to this link. If you wish to go to the security context holder, which is a very important thing, because the security context holder, as we have said before, is the backbone of the Spring security. Everything happen with the Spring security happen under the security context holder. And there are the authentication provider, if you wish to know about. And finally, this is the technical overview of the Spring security, which you can gives you, if you go through it, it will give you a good insight about everything that we have just said so far, and how we can implement this user detail service or granted authority and everything, all this within this article. Now, by doing this, I believe we have finished the first way of implementing Spring security, which is by extending the web security configurer adapter with the use of the user detail service and the user details over the web application that we have developed in the previous course. On next videos, we will start talking about the enabling method security, which is the Spring security annotations. Thank you very much.